Hello, dear friends, and welcome to Sleep Stories TV. Tonight we journey to the windswept plains of Troy in our Greek Mythology Stories, Episode 13, Clash of Titans at Troy. A city stands defiant, yet its fate hangs in the balance. Hector, Troy's noble defender, faces Achilles, a warrior forged in rage. If you haven't joined Sleep Stories TV, subscribe now. Tap that bell and let no tale pass you by. Now close your eyes and step into the myth where honor meets vengeance and the clash of titans begins. After 9 long years of war, the city of Troy still stood, and the conflict had become a personal duel between two icons, Hector, the protector of Troy, and Achilles, the unbeatable warrior of the Greeks. The plains before the towering walls of Ilium, once green and vibrant, were now scarred with the marks of relentless battle, churned earth, broken spears, and the scattered remains of heroes who had fallen in pursuit of glory or defense of home. The Trojans, huddled behind their formidable defenses, looked to Hector, their prince and greatest champion, whose courage shone like a beacon in the darkness of war. He was a man of duty, not just a warrior, but a husband to Andromache, a father to young Astyanax, and the steadfast shield of his people. His every step on the battlefield carried the weight of Troy's survival, his spear a promise to protect the city from the relentless tide of Greek invaders. Hector's heart beat for his family and his homeland, his resolve forged in the fires of love and obligation. He fought not for fame, but for the walls that sheltered his kin, for the future of his son, and for the honor of his father, King Priam, whose weary eyes watched from the ramparts, praying for deliverance. Across the blood-soaked plain, the Greeks rallied around Achilles, a man whose name was synonymous with invincibility, a warrior whose very presence could turn the tide of battle. Born of the sea goddess Thetis and the mortal king Peleus, Achilles was a paradox, a man blessed with divine strength, yet cursed with human flaws. His armor gleamed under the Trojan sun, each piece a testament to his prowess. But it was his eyes that told the true story, fierce, unyielding, and hungry for Kleos, the eternal glory that would ensure his name lived beyond the grave. Unlike Hector, Achilles fought not for a city or a people, but for himself. His every swing of the sword, every cry of defiance was a step toward immortality, a defiance of the mortal fate that awaited even him. The Greeks revered him, their Myrmidon soldiers following him, as if he were a god walking among men, yet his heart burned with a fire that cared little for their collective cause. To Achilles, the war was a stage, and he was its star, destined to shine brighter than any other. The clash between these two men was no mere skirmish. It was the culmination of a war that had bled both sides dry. For 9 years, the Greeks had laid siege to Troy, their ships crowding the shores, their tents stretching across the horizon like a second city. The Trojans, defiant and resilient, had held their ground, their walls unbreached, their spirit unbroken. Yet the conflict had grown personal, its stakes no longer just the fate of a city, but the measure of 2 men who embodied the ideals of their people. Hector, the defender, stood as the soul of Troy, his every action a testament to sacrifice and loyalty. He was not invincible, nor did he claim to be. His strength came from his resolve, from the knowledge that behind him stood a city that trusted him to stand firm. Achilles, by contrast, was a force of nature, a man whose very existence seemed to mock the limitations of mortality. His speed, his strength, his skill with spear and shield, these were the stuff of legend, whispered in awe by friend and foe alike. The tension between them was palpable, a thread pulled taut across the battlefield ready to snap. The Trojans saw Hector as their salvation, the one man who could hold back the Greek onslaught. The Greeks, meanwhile, saw Achilles as their trump card, the warrior who could shatter Troy's defenses and bring the war to its end. Yet neither man was merely a symbol. They were flesh and blood driven by desires and fears, as human as those of the lowliest soldier. Hector dreamed of peace, of a day when he could lay down his spear and hold his son without the shadow of war looming over them. Achilles dreamed of eternity, of a name that would echo through the ages, untouched by the decay of time. These dreams, so different, yet so deeply human, set the stage for a confrontation that would define the Trojan War, a duel that would pit duty against glory, love against pride, and mortality against the desperate quest for something greater. As the 10th year dawned, the air was thick with anticipation. The gods themselves, watching from the heights of Olympus, took sides their divine machinations, weaving through the mortal struggle below. Zeus, torn between his love for Hector and his promise to Thetis, watched with a heavy heart. Athena, ever the patron of the Greeks, sharpened her gaze on Achilles, while Apollo, protector of Troy, whispered strength into Hector's soul. The battlefield was more than a clash of armies. It was a crucible where the fates of men and gods intertwined, where every spear thrown and every shield raised carried the weight of destiny. The war had worn down both sides, but it was the rivalry between Hector and Achilles that gave it new life, transforming a sprawling conflict into a singular, searing moment of truth. The city of Troy, with its high towers and ancient walls, stood as the prize, but it was the hearts of these two warriors that would decide its fate. Their duel was not just a battle. It was a story, one that would be told and retold, a tale of heroism, tragedy, and the fragile, fleeting beauty of what it means to be human. But our story begins not with a battle, but with a quarrel within the Greek ranks, when King Agamemnon insults Achilles and strips him of his honor. The Greek camp, sprawling along the Trojan shore, was a city of tents and tempers, its air thick with the smoke of cooking fires and the tension of men far from home. For 9 years, the Achaeans had fought, bled, and died before the unyielding walls of Troy, their unity fraying under the weight of time and loss. At the heart of this uneasy alliance stood Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, commander of the Greek forces, a man whose authority was as hard-won as it was precarious. He was no warrior like Achilles, no hero whose name inspired awe, but a leader whose power rested on the loyalty of lesser kings and the strength of his vast army. Yet his pride, as towering as the walls of Troy, would ignite a spark that threatened to consume the Greek cause from within. The trouble began with a priest of Apollo, Chryses, who came to the Greek camp bearing ransom for his daughter Chryseis, a captive taken in a raid and claimed by Agamemnon as his prize. The old man's pleas were humble, his hands clutching a golden staff adorned with the gods' sacred ribbons, but Agamemnon's heart was unmoved. With a sneer, he dismissed the priest, mocking his devotion and sending him away in disgrace. The camp fell silent, the warriors exchanging uneasy glances, for to scorn a priest was to invite the wrath of the gods. And Apollo, swift and merciless, answered. A plague descended upon the Greeks, arrows of disease raining down unseen, felling men in their tents, their bodies piling high as the pyres burned day and night. The army groaned under the weight of divine retribution, their morale crumbling as quickly as their ranks. It was Achilles, bold and unyielding, who called the assembly to face the crisis. His voice, sharp as a blade, cut through the murmurs of fear, demanding answers. The seer Calchas, trembling but compelled by Achilles' protection, revealed the truth. Apollo's anger stemmed from Agamemnon's insult, and only the return of Chryseis would appease the god. The warriors nodded their eyes, turning to their king, but Agamemnon's face darkened with fury. To yield his prize was to lose face, to admit weakness before his men, and pride would not allow it. He rose, his voice booming across the camp, accusing Achilles of undermining his authority, of seeking to supplant him as leader. The quarrel escalated, words like sparks igniting a wildfire, until Agamemnon, in a fit of arrogance, declared he would return Chryseis, but take Briseis, Achilles' own war prize, as compensation. The insult was a wound deeper than any spear could inflict. Briseis was not just a captive to Achilles. She was a symbol of his honor, his kleos, the tangible proof of his valor, earned through blood and sweat. To strip her from him was to strip him of his status, to reduce the greatest warrior of the Greeks to a mere subordinate. Achilles' hand flew to his sword, his eyes blazing with a rage that seemed to shake the very air. Only the intervention of Athena, sent by Hera to calm him, stayed his blade. Her voice, soft yet commanding, whispered in his ear, promising greater honor if he restrained his wrath. Achilles relented, but his words were venom. He swore an oath before the gods and men he would fight no more for Agamemnon, nor for the Greeks, until his honor was restored. With that, he turned his back on the assembly, striding to his tent by the sea, his myrmidons trailing behind like shadows. The camp was stunned. Achilles was their spearhead, their invincible champion, the man who could face 100 Trojans and emerge unscathed. Without him, the Greeks were a body without a heart. Their strength sapped, their hope dimmed. Agamemnon, unmoved, sent men to take Briseis, and Achilles, true to his word, did not resist. But his rage, Manus, a divine fury, burned hotter than ever. Alone in his tent, he poured his heart out to his mother Thetis, the sea goddess whose love for her son was as boundless as the ocean. Kneeling by the shore, he begged her to intervene, to bend the will of Zeus himself. "Let the Greeks suffer," he pleaded. "Let them taste defeat, so they might know the cost of dishonoring him." Thetis, her silver feet gleaming on the waves, ascended to Olympus, her tears falling like pearls as she knelt before the father of gods. Zeus, torn by the pleas of a goddess, and the balance of fate nodded, sealing the Greeks' doom. The quarrel had done more than fracture the Greek alliance. It had shifted the tide of the war. As Achilles withdrew, nursing his wounded pride, the Trojans sensed opportunity. Hector, ever vigilant, stood ready to lead his people, his spear gleaming with purpose. The absence of Achilles was a gift from the gods, a chance to drive the Greeks into the sea and end the siege once and for all. The stage was set for a new chapter in the war, one where Hector's courage would shine, and the Greeks would pay dearly for the hubris of their king. Yet beneath it all, Achilles' rage simmered a storm waiting to break its fury, destined to reshape the fate of Troy and all who fought for her. Deeply wounded, Achilles made a terrible decision. He withdrew from the war and begged his mother, the goddess Thetis, to persuade Zeus to let the Greeks lose. The Greek camp, already battered by plague and discord, felt the weight of his absence like a storm cloud blotting out the sun. Achilles, the swift-footed warrior, whose very name struck fear into Trojan hearts, had vanished from the battlefield, his tent by the sea a silent monument to his rage. The Myrmidons, his loyal warriors, stood idle, their spears unbloodied, their spirits dampened by their leader's retreat. The air was thick with unease, as if the gods themselves held their breath, watching the unraveling of a war that had already claimed countless lives. Achilles' pride, that blazing fire within him, had turned inward, consuming not his enemies, but his own comrades, whose fate now hung in the balance. His honor, stripped by Agamemnon's callous act, was worth more to him than the lives of men he had fought beside for nearly a decade. In the solitude of his tent, Achilles sat, his heart a battleground of fury and pain. The waves lapped at the shore outside their rhythm, a faint echo of his mother's divine presence. Thetis, the sea goddess, had always been his shield, her love a constant in a world of chaos. As a boy, she had dipped him in the river Styx, granting him near invincibility, save for the fragile heel she held. Now, as he knelt by the water's edge, his voice broke with anguish, calling to her across the vast divide between mortal and divine. "Mother," he cried, his words carried on the wind, "Agamemnon has shamed me, taken what is mine, and made me nothing before my peers. Let the Greeks fall, let their ships burn, let them know they cannot win without me." His plea was not just a son's lament, but a demand for vengeance, a wish to see the world bend to his will. Thetis emerged from the sea, her form shimmering like moonlight on water, her eyes heavy with sorrow. She knew the cost of her son's request, knew the fleeting time she had with him, for the fates had decreed his life would be short, but glorious. Yet she could not deny him. Ascending to Olympus, Thetis knelt before Zeus, her silver feet grazing the golden clouds. The Father of gods sat on his throne, his gaze distant, his mind a tapestry of mortal and divine threads. Thetis's voice was soft but unyielding, her tears falling like rain as she begged for her son's honor to be restored. "Let the Trojans triumph," she pleaded. "Let the Greeks taste defeat until they see Achilles' worth." Zeus, whose heart was torn between his love for Troy and his duty to balance the scales of fate, hesitated. Hera, ever watchful, bristled at the thought of Troy's success, her loyalty to the Greeks unwavering. But Thetis's grief moved him, and he nodded his decree, a silent thunder that shifted the heavens. The gods stirred their voices, a chorus of approval and dissent, for Zeus's decision would ripple through the mortal world, bringing death and despair to the Greek camp. On the plains of Troy, the absence of Achilles was a wound that bled the Greeks dry. Without their greatest warrior, their lines faltered, their courage waned. The Trojans, sensing weakness, rallied under Hector's banner. He stood at the forefront, his armor gleaming, his voice a clarion call that rallied his men. Hector was no mere soldier. He was Troy's heart, its unwavering defender, a man who fought not for glory, but for the survival of his people. His wife Andromache watched from the walls, her heart heavy with fear, while his son Astyanax played unaware of the stakes his father carried. Hector's spear was a lightning bolt, his shield a bulwark, and under his leadership, the Trojans surged forward like a tide driving the Greeks back toward their beached ships. The once mighty Achaean army, so confident in their numbers, now faced the specter of defeat, their tents pressed against the sea's edge, their hopes dwindling with each passing day. Achilles, in his self-imposed exile, was not blind to the suffering. From his tent he could hear the clash of bronze, the cries of the wounded, the distant roar of battle. Yet his heart remained hardened, his pride a wall no plea could breach. His comrades, Odysseus, Ajax, Diomedes, came to him, their voices heavy with desperation, begging him to return. They spoke of honor, of duty, of the men dying for a cause he had once championed. But Achilles' eyes were cold, his words sharper than any blade. "Why should I fight for a king who scorns me?" he demanded. "Let Agamemnon beg for my aid, let him restore what he stole." His refusal was a dagger to the Greek cause, each word a betrayal of the men who had fought beside him. Yet within his rage lay a deeper truth. Achilles' menace was not just anger, but an assertion of his worth, a demand that his life, so brief and brilliant, be recognized as indispensable. The gods watched their divine machinations weaving through the mortal struggle. Apollo, protector of Troy, strengthened Hector's arm, while Athena, patron of the Greeks, whispered strategies to Odysseus in the night. The balance of war had shifted, and the Greeks paid the price for their king's hubris and their hero's pride. As the Trojans advanced, their war cries echoing across the plain, the Greek camp became a place of fear and despair. Men whispered of Achilles, their lost champion, wondering if he would ever return or if his wrath would doom them all. The stage was set for a turning point, a moment when the cost of Achilles' absence would become unbearable, when the bonds of friendship and duty would pull him back into the fray, setting the course for a tragedy that would echo through the ages. The absence of Achilles immediately changed the tide of battle, and under Hector's leadership, the Trojans surged forward like a storm, pushing the Greeks back to the sea's edge. The plains of Troy, once a contested no-man's land, now thundered with the charge of Trojan warriors, their spears gleaming under the relentless sun, their war cries a chorus that shook the earth. Hector, Prince of Troy, stood at the forefront, his bronze armor a beacon of hope for his people, his presence a terror to the Greeks. He was not merely a warrior, but the soul of the city, a man whose every action carried the weight of Troy's survival. His dark eyes burned with determination, his voice rallying his men with a clarity that cut through the chaos of battle. To the Trojans, Hector was more than a leader. He was their shield, their sword, the one man who could stand against the Greek onslaught and hold the line. From the high walls of Ilium, his wife Andromache watched with a heart torn between pride and dread, while his infant son, Astyanax, remained blissfully unaware of the stakes his father bore. Without Achilles, the Greek lines crumbled like sand before a wave. The Myrmidons, those fierce warriors who followed their leader with unwavering loyalty, stood idle by the shore, their absence a gaping wound in the Greek ranks. Agamemnon, his authority shaken by the plague, and the quarrel struggled to hold his coalition together. Odysseus, cunning and resolute, rallied men with words as sharp as any blade, while Ajax, towering and unyielding, fought with the strength of a bull. But it was not enough. The Greeks, once a relentless tide, were now a faltering force, their tents pressed against the beached ships, their backs to the sea. The Trojan advance was relentless, a storm of bronze and fire, and Hector was its heart. He moved through the battlefield with a grace that belied his ferocity, his spear finding its mark with deadly precision, his shield a bulwark against Greek desperation. Each fallen Greek was a step closer to victory, a chance to end the siege that had choked Troy for nearly a decade. The Trojans fought with a fervor born of hope, their spirits lifted by the absence of the Greeks' greatest weapon. Hector's leadership was a flame that kindled their courage, his every command a spark that drove them forward. He was no god, no invincible force like Achilles, but his humanity was his strength. He fought for his family, for the city that stood behind him, for the future he dreamed of, where his son could grow in peace. His men followed him, not out of fear, but out of love, their trust in him absolute. From the ramparts, King Priam watched his aged heart swelling with pride, yet heavy with the knowledge that Hector carried the weight of a city on his shoulders. The gods, too, looked down, their divine gaze fixed on the mortal struggle. Apollo, protector of Troy, lent strength to Hector's arm, his divine favor a whisper of encouragement in the prince's ear. The Trojans surged, their chariots rumbling across the plain, their archers raining arrows like a deadly hail, driving the Greeks ever closer to their ships. The Greek camp was a scene of desperation. Men scrambled to reinforce their lines, their shields raised against the Trojan onslaught, their voices hoarse with cries for reinforcements. The ships, those wooden lifelines that had carried them across the sea, were now at risk, their hulls vulnerable to Trojan fire. Agamemnon, his face etched with worry, stood among his commanders, his earlier arrogance replaced by the grim reality of defeat. Odysseus, ever the strategist, proposed counterattacks, while Diomedes, fierce and unyielding, led sorties to stem the tide. But the absence of Achilles was a shadow that loomed over every effort. The Greeks fought bravely, but their strength was waning, their hope flickering like a dying flame. The Trojans, under Hector's command, pressed their advantage, their momentum unstoppable, their blades carving through Greek defenses with ruthless efficiency. Hector's Aristeia, his moment of supreme valor, was a spectacle that would be sung of for generations. He fought not for glory, but for duty, his every strike a testament to his love for Troy. He clashed with Ajax, their shields ringing like thunder, neither yielding until the gods themselves parted them. He drove back Diomedes, his spear a blur, forcing the Greek hero to retreat. The Trojans cheered, their voices a wave that drowned out the Greek cries of despair. Hector's presence was a rallying cry, a reminder that Troy was not yet lost, that its walls still stood, that its people still breathed. From the walls, the Trojan women and elders watched their prayers rising to the heavens, their hopes pinned on the man who stood between them and destruction. Andromache clutched her son, her tears falling silently, knowing that each victory brought Hector closer to a fate she could not bear to name. Yet even in his triumph, Hector was mortal, his strength finite, his heart heavy with the burden of leadership. He knew the Greeks were not defeated, only weakened, and that Achilles' absence would not last forever. Still, he fought on, driven by the knowledge that every moment he held the Greeks at bay was a moment of reprieve for his city. The battlefield was a crucible, forging heroes and breaking them, and Hector stood at its heart, a man who carried the hopes of a nation. The Greeks, pushed to the edge of annihilation, looked to their ships, their only means of escape, and wondered if they would ever see home again. The war, once a contest of armies, had become a test of wills, and Hector's will was iron-tempered by love and duty. But the shadow of Achilles lingered, a storm waiting to break, and the stage was set for a turning point that would shift the balance once more, drawing the war toward its inevitable tragic climax. As the Greeks stood on the brink of annihilation, Patroclus, Achilles' closest friend and companion, could no longer stand by and watch. The Greek camp, pressed against the sea, was a scene of chaos and despair, the air thick with the smoke of burning pyres and the cries of wounded men. The Trojans, led by Hector's relentless charge, had driven the Achaeans to their ships, their flames licking at the wooden hulls, threatening to trap the Greeks in a fiery grave. Patroclus, whose heart was as loyal as it was brave, segment. "Break here, brave," stood at the edge of the camp, his eyes fixed on the distant battle. He was no warrior like Achilles, no towering figure like Ajax, but his courage was born of compassion, a love for his comrades that burned brighter than any lust for glory. Patroclus was Achilles' shadow, his confidant, his brother in arms, a man whose quiet strength had steadied the Myrmidons through years of war. Now, as he watched the Greek lines buckle under Hector's onslaught, his heart could bear it no longer. The sight of his people dying, their hopes fading with each Trojan advance, stirred something deep within him, a call to act, to save, to fight. Patroclus's bond with Achilles was a thing of legend, a friendship forged in the crucible of war, deeper than blood. While Achilles nursed his wounded pride in his tent, Patroclus moved among the men, tending wounds, offering words of encouragement, his presence a flicker of light in the gathering dark. But the sight of Hector's spear, gleaming like a comet, as it felled Greek after Greek, was too much to bear. The Trojans were at the ships, their torches blazing, their war cries drowning out hustle-bustle out the Greek screams. Patroclus could not stand idle while his world burned. He sought out Achilles, his voice steady but urgent, pleading for action. "The men are dying," he said, his eyes searching Achilles' face. "Hector will burn the ships if you do not return. Will you let pride, force majeure, our cause, die for your pride?" Achilles' gaze was hard, his jaw set, but his heart was not stone. "I cannot fight," he said, "but I will let you wear my armor. Drive the Trojans back, but do not chase them to the walls." The words were a lifeline, a promise of salvation, but also a warning heavy with the weight of fate. Patroclus donned Achilles' armor, its bronze plates gleaming like the sun, and strode onto the battlefield. The sight of him clad in the hero's garb sent a ripple of fear through the Trojans and a surge of hope through the Greeks. For a moment it seemed Achilles himself had returned, and the Trojans hesitated, their momentum faltering. Patroclus fought like a man possessed, his spear, a blur, his shield, a wall of defiance driving the Trojans back from the ships. The Greeks rallied, their voices rising in a desperate cheer, but Patroclus, caught in the frenzy of battle, forgot Achilles' warning. He pursued the Trojans beyond the ships, chasing glory, chasing victory, all the way to the very walls of Troy. The gods watched, their divine hearts torn, for Patroclus was beloved yet doomed. Apollo, guiding Hector's hand, struck him down, and Hector, with a single thrust, ended Patroclus's life at the foot of the city. The armor, Achilles' armor, was stripped from his body, a trophy of war, and the Greeks fell silent, their hopes shattered. The news reached Achilles like a thunderbolt, his scream of grief shaking the heavens. The camp, already reeling, stopped in its tracks, for the sound was not human. It was the wail of a god, a force of nature, a storm of rage and sorrow. Patroclus had been more than a friend. He was the tether that kept Achilles human, the one who softened his pride with loyalty and love. Now he was gone, and Achilles' heart was a void filled only with hatred for Hector, the man who had taken him. The battlefield fell quiet, the Trojans pausing to strip their prize, the Greeks frozen in horror. Hector stood over the body, his face a mask of grim resolve, knowing what he had done, knowing what it would cost. The war, already a decade long, had taken a new turn, one that would lead to its bitter end, and all because of a single act of love and a single act of vengeance. Achilles' rage, once aimed at Agamemnon, now turned on Hector, a fire that would consume all in its path. He swore vengeance, his voice a low growl, his eyes burning with a fury that made even his own men step back. The Greeks, battered and bloodied, looked to him for salvation, but his heart was elsewhere, lost in grief, plotting death. Thetis, his mother, wept in the sea, her divine heart breaking for her son, for she knew his fate was tied to Hector's, and no god could change it. The battlefield, soaked in blood, awaited its final act, a duel that would shake the foundations of the world. Patroclus's death was the spark, and Achilles' wrath was the flame, and Troy would burn before it was done. Achilles agreed to let Patroclus wear his armor into battle, but gave him a fateful warning. Drive the Trojans from the ships, but you must not pursue them to the city walls. The Greek camp, teetering on the edge of ruin, buzzed with a fragile hope as Patroclus prepared to take the field. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and smoke. The distant clash of bronze, a grim reminder of the Trojans' relentless advance. Achilles stood outside his tent, his eyes dark with conflict, his heart torn between pride and the desperate pleas of his dearest friend. Patroclus, clad in borrowed armor, was a vision of resolve, his face set with determination, yet softened by the love that had driven him to this moment. The armor of Achilles, forged by divine hands, gleamed like the sun, its bronze plates etched with the weight of legend. To the Greeks, it was a symbol of their greatest warrior, a beacon that could turn the tide. To the Trojans, it was a specter of fear, a sign that Achilles himself might return. But Achilles, still bound by his oath against Agamemnon, would not fight. His warning to Patroclus was sharp, delivered with a voice that trembled with both authority and dread. "Save the ships," he said, gripping his friend's arm, "but do not chase glory. Return to me." Patroclus nodded, his heart pounding, not with fear, but with purpose. He was no Achilles, no god-touched warrior whose name alone could scatter armies, but he was brave, loyal, and driven by a love for his comrades that Achilles' pride could not match. As he stepped onto the battlefield, The Greeks let out a ragged cheer, their spirits lifted by the sight of Achilles' armor, believing their champion had returned. The Myrmidons, silent for too long, rallied behind him. Their spears raised their voices a roar of defiance. Patroclus fought like a man possessed, his movements swift and sure, the borrowed armor lending him an aura of invincibility. The Trojans, caught off guard, faltered as he drove them back from the ships, his spear finding its mark again and again. The flames that had threatened the Greek fleet flickered and died. The Trojans retreating under the onslaught, their confidence shaken. For a moment it seemed the tide had turned, that Patroclus in Achilles' guise could single-handedly save the Greeks from ruin. But the frenzy of battle, that wild, intoxicating Aristeia, took hold of Patroclus' heart. The clash of swords, the thunder of hooves, the cries of the fallen. It was a song that drowned out Achilles' warning. He pressed forward, his blood singing with victory, chasing the Trojans across the plain toward the towering walls of Troy. The Greeks followed their hope, rekindled their shouts echoing as they drove their enemies back. Patroclus was a storm, his spear a lightning bolt, his shield a bulwark against the Trojan counterattacks. He felled warrior after warrior, his name, though unknown to the Trojans, becoming a whisper of dread. From the walls, the Trojan women watched in horror, their prayers to Apollo growing frantic. Hector, ever vigilant, rallied his men, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. But even he hesitated, seeing the figure in Achilles' armor, unsure if it was the invincible hero himself or another. The gods, watching from Olympus, saw the thread of fate tightening. Apollo, protector of Troy, grew wroth, his divine gaze fixed on Patroclus, who had dared to overstep his mortal bounds. Athena, ever cunning, watched with a knowing smile, her loyalty to the Greeks unwavering, but her plans deeper than mortal eyes could see. Patroclus, caught in the ecstasy of battle, did not sense the divine hands guiding his doom. He fought on, driving the Trojans to the very gates of their city, his heart alight with the dream of ending the war, of breaking Troy's walls, of proving himself worthy of Achilles' trust. But the warning lingered, a faint echo in his mind, drowned out by the roar of victory. He struck down Sarpedon, a son of Zeus, and the heavens themselves trembled, for the death of a demigod was no small thing. Zeus, torn by grief for his son, allowed the battle to continue, his will bent by the pleas of Thetis and the weight of fate. Then came the moment of reckoning. Apollo, veiled in mist, struck Patroclus, loosening the divine armor clouding his mind. Euphorbus, a Trojan warrior, wounded him with a spear, and Hector, seizing the moment, drove his blade through Patroclus's chest. The Greek hero fell at the foot of Troy's walls, his blood soaking the earth, his breath fading as the light left his eyes. The Trojans cheered, their fear replaced by triumph, while the Greeks froze, their hope shattered. Hector stripped the armor from Patroclus's body, claiming it as a prize, unaware that he had just sealed his own fate. The battlefield grew still, the air heavy with the weight of what had been lost. Patroclus, the gentle warrior who fought for love, lay dead, and the war, already a decade of blood, turned toward its darkest chapter. The news of Patroclus's death reached Achilles like a blade to the heart. His scream, a sound of raw, primal grief, echoed across the plain, shaking the Greek camp and startling the Trojans. The gods paused, their divine hearts stirred by the sound, for it was not just a man's cry, but the birth of a wrath that would consume all in its path. Achilles' rage, once aimed at Agamemnon, now burned for Hector, a fire that would not be quenched until blood answered blood. The stage was set for a reckoning, a duel that would pit the greatest warriors of two worlds against each other, and the plains of Troy would bear witness to a tragedy that would echo through the ages. Wearing Achilles' armor, Patroclus became a nightmare for the Trojans, but in the ecstasy of victory he forgot the warning, and was slain by Hector at the foot of the city. The battlefield before Troy's towering walls was a cauldron of chaos, the air thick with dust, the clash of bronze and the cries of men locked in mortal combat. Patroclus, clad in the gleaming armor of Achilles, strode forth like a god, his presence a thunderbolt that shattered Trojan resolve. The bronze plates, etched with divine craftsmanship, caught the sun's rays, casting a glow that made him seem invincible. A specter of Achilles himself returned to wreak havoc. The Greeks, battered and desperate, rallied behind him, their voices rising in a ragged cheer as they saw the Trojans falter. Patroclus' spear was a whirlwind, his shield a wall of defiance, and with every step he drove the enemy back from the Greek ships. Their flames extinguished their threat to the fleet, snuffed out. To the Trojans he was a terror, a figure of dread whose every strike seemed to carry the weight of divine wrath. Yet Patroclus was no Achilles. He was a man driven by loyalty and love, his heart burning with the need to save his comrades, to turn the tide of a war that had pushed the Greeks to the brink. The Trojans, who had surged under Hector's leadership, now stumbled, their lines breaking as Patroclus advanced. He fought with a ferocity that belied his gentle nature, his spear finding its mark with deadly precision. Trojan warriors fell before him, their blood soaking the earth, their cries swallowed by the roar of battle. The Greeks followed their spirits, lifted their hope rekindled by the sight of Achilles' armor gleaming in the fray. Patroclus was a storm, his movements swift and sure, his courage a beacon that drew the Achaeans forward. He drove the Trojans across the plain, away from the ships, toward the high walls of Troy that loomed like a fortress of fate. The Trojan women, watching from the ramparts, clutched their children, their prayers to Apollo growing frantic. Andromache, Hector's wife, stood among them, her heart a knot of fear, sensing the shift in the battle's tide. Hector, ever the defender, rallied his men, his voice a steady drumbeat against the chaos, urging them to hold the line. But even he felt the weight of the figure in Achilles' armor, unsure if it was the invincible hero or another, yet knowing he could not yield. In the heat of battle, Patroclus was consumed by the Aristeia, that wild, exultant state, where a warrior becomes more than mortal, a force of destiny itself. His blood sang with victory, his heart pounded with the thrill of driving the Trojans back, of seeing their fear, of tasting the possibility of ending the war. Achilles' warning, drive the Trojans from the ships, but do not pursue them to the walls, faded like a whisper in a storm. Patroclus pressed forward his spear, felling warrior after warrior, his path leading ever closer to Troy's gates. He struck down Sarpedon, a son of Zeus, and the heavens themselves trembled, for the death of a demigod was a wound to the divine order. Zeus, watching from Olympus, wept for his son, his heart torn between love and the inexorable pull of fate. The gods stirred their voices, a chorus of conflict. Apollo, protector of Troy, burned with anger, while Athena, patron of the Greeks, watched with a knowing gaze, her plans weaving through the mortal struggle below. Patroclus, lost in the ecstasy of battle, did not see the divine hands aligning against him. He fought on, his eyes fixed on the walls of Troy, dreaming of glory, of breaking the city's defenses, of proving himself worthy of Achilles' trust. The Trojans fell back, their courage waning, their lines thinning as Patroclus advanced. But Apollo, cloaked in mist, descended to the battlefield, his divine will a shadow over the mortal fray. With a subtle touch, he loosened the straps of Achilles' armor, clouding Patroclus' mind, sapping his strength. Euphorbus, a Trojan warrior, saw his chance and struck his spear, piercing Patroclus' back, a wound that staggered him but did not fell him. Hector, ever watchful, saw the faltering figure and moved with the precision of a predator. His spear drove through Patroclus' chest, a single fatal thrust that sent the Greek hero crumpling to the earth at the foot of Troy's walls. The battlefield fell silent for a heartbeat, The Greeks frozen in horror, the Trojans erupting in a cheer that shook the heavens. Hector stood over the fallen warrior, his face grim, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had done. He stripped the armor from Patroclus's body, claiming it as a prize, its bronze gleaming in his hands, a trophy that would mark him for doom. The Greeks, seeing their hope fall, scrambled to protect the body, their spears raised in desperation, but the Trojans pressed their advantage, their momentum restored. Patroclus, the gentle soul who fought for love, lay dead, his blood pooling in the dust, his sacrifice a spark that would ignite a firestorm. The news of his death raced through the Greek camp, reaching Achilles like a blade to the soul. His scream of grief, a sound that seemed to rend the sky, marked the birth of a wrath that would consume all in its path. The war, already a decade of blood and loss, had reached its first great climax, a moment that would set the stage for a duel that would echo through the ages as Achilles' rage turned toward Hector, the man who had taken everything from him. When news of Patroclus's death reached Achilles, his rage against Agamemnon transformed into an endless grief and hatred aimed at Hector. The Greek camp, already steeped in despair, seemed to hold its breath as the messenger's words struck Achilles like a spear to the heart. He stood by his tent, the sea lapping at the shore behind him, its rhythm a cruel mockery of the life that had been snuffed out. Patroclus, his closest friend, his brother in arms, the one soul who tethered him to humanity, was gone slain at the foot of Troy's walls, his body stripped of the very armor Achilles had lent him. The air itself seemed to shudder as Achilles let out a scream. A primal wail that echoed across the plain, a sound so raw, so piercing, it silenced the clamor of battle. The Greeks, battered and broken, froze their eyes, turning to their champion, while the Trojans, clutching their hard-won prize, paused, sensing a shift in the world's balance. This was no mere cry of sorrow. It was the birth of a wrath so fierce it seemed to shake the heavens, a menace that would burn through all who stood in its path. Achilles fell to his knees, his hands clawing at the earth, tearing at his hair, his face streaked with ash and tears. The man who had once stood as a god among mortals was now a figure of anguish, his invincibility shattered by loss. Patroclus had been more than a friend. He was the mirror of Achilles' soul, the one who tempered his pride with kindness, who reminded him of the world beyond glory. They had shared laughter in the quiet moments of war, shared dreams of a life beyond the battlefield, shared a bond that no spear could sever until now. The image of Patroclus's body, broken and defiled, lying in the dust beneath Troy's walls, seared itself into Achilles' mind. His rage, once directed at Agamemnon for the theft of his honor, now found a new target, Hector, the Trojan prince who had wielded the fatal blow, who had dared to strip Achilles' armor as a trophy. In that moment, Hector became not just a man, but the embodiment of all that Achilles had lost, a name that fueled a hatred deeper than any he had ever known. The Greek camp, already teetering on the edge of collapse, felt the weight of Achilles' grief like a gathering storm. His Myrmidons, loyal to the end, stood silent. Their spears lowered their hearts, heavy with the loss of Patroclus, who had been their brother as much as Achilles's. The other Greek leaders, Odysseus, Ajax, Diomedes, came to him, their voices soft with condolence, but their words fell on deaf ears. Achilles' eyes burned with a fire that no plea could quench, his voice a low growl as he swore vengeance. "Hector will die," he said, each word a vow etched in blood. "I will tear his heart from his chest and leave his body for the dogs." The Greeks, desperate for their champion's return, saw not hope but terror in his face, for this was no longer the Achilles who fought for glory. This was a man consumed, a force of destruction, whose wrath would spare no one. Thetis, his divine mother, felt her son's pain across the vast sea. Rising from the waves, her silver feet gleaming, She came to him, her eyes brimming with tears. She knew the cost of his path, knew the fates had woven a thread that tied Achilles' life to Hector's death. "My son," she whispered, her voice like the tide, "your grief will lead you to your doom. If you pursue this vengeance, your life will be short." But Achilles, his heart, a furnace of sorrow and rage, looked into her eyes and spoke with a resolve that chilled even a goddess. "Let it be short," he said, "if I can see Hector dead at my feet." Thetis wept, her tears falling like pearls into the sea, for she could not sway her son from his course. His love for Patroclus, his hatred for Hector, had become a force greater than divine will, a fire that would burn until it consumed all in its path. The gods on Olympus stirred their divine council, divided by the mortal tragedy unfolding below. Zeus, torn between his love for Hector and his promise to Thetis, watched with a heavy heart, knowing the balance of fate was shifting. Athena, ever loyal to the Greeks, sharpened her gaze on Achilles, ready to aid his vengeance, while Apollo, protector of Troy, mourned the path that would lead to Hector's fall. The battlefield, soaked in blood, awaited its reckoning, the air thick with the tension of a war about to reach its climax. Achilles' grief was a wound that bled not just for Patroclus, but for himself, for the humanity he was losing, with every step toward vengeance. The Greeks, sensing his resolve, began to rally, their hope rekindled not by love, but by fear of the man he had become. Hector, within the walls of Troy, felt the weight of his act, knowing the armor he had claimed was a beacon that would draw Achilles to him like a moth to flame. The stage was set for a confrontation that would define the Trojan War, a clash, not just of men, but of ideals, duty against vengeance, love against rage. Achilles' heart, once torn by pride, was now a furnace of grief, forging a purpose that would not waver. He would return to battle, not for Agamemnon, not for the Greeks, but for Patroclus, for the friend whose death had broken him. The plains of Troy, scarred and bloodied, would bear witness to a wrath that no mortal could withstand, a fury that would carve a path to Hector and leave a trail of bodies in its wake. The war, already a decade of suffering, had reached a turning point, and Achilles' return would be no triumph but a tragedy, a prelude to a duel that would echo through the ages as the cost of love and loss, so that her son could have his revenge. Thetis went to the smith god Hephaestus to forge a new suit of armor for Achilles, a divine masterpiece. The Greek camp, shrouded in the shadow of Patroclus' death, was a place of muted despair, the air heavy with the weight of Achilles' grief and the distant clamor of Trojan triumph. Thetis, the sea goddess, emerged from the waves, her silver feet trailing mist, her heart breaking for her son, whose rage now burned brighter than his life's fleeting flame. She knew the path he had chosen, vengeance for Patroclus, at the cost of his own days, as the fates had decreed a short life for her mortal son. Yet she could not deny him, could not quench the fire that consumed him. With a mother's love, she ascended to the fiery forges of Hephaestus, the lame god whose hands crafted wonders that bridged the mortal and divine. Her plea was soft but urgent, her voice trembling like the tide. "My son has lost his armor," she said, "and with it his friend. Craft for him a suit that will make him a god among men, a shield to carry his wrath to Hector's heart." Hephaestus, moved by her tears and his own debt to Thetis, who had once sheltered him, nodded, his hammer already ringing with purpose. In the heart of his volcanic forge, Hephaestus set to work his bellows, roaring his anvil, singing with each strike. Sparks flew like stars, the air shimmering with heat, as he poured his divine skill into the task. The armor he crafted was no mere protection. It was a work of art, a testament to the glory and tragedy of the human world. The shield, broad and radiant, was the centerpiece, its surface etched with scenes of life and death, peace and war. There were fields blooming with harvest cities dancing in festival, and armies clashing in blood-soaked strife. A mirror of the world Achilles fought for and against. Constellations gleamed on its rim, the Pleiades and Orion, as if the heavens themselves were bound to its surface. The breastplate shone like the sun, its bronze unyielding, while the helmet crested with gold framed a face that would soon strike terror into Trojan hearts. Greaves and gauntlets completed the set, each piece a marvel, forged not just for battle, but to embody the fleeting beauty of a hero's life. Thetis, watching the work, wept silently, knowing this armor would carry her son to both his vengeance and his doom. When Thetis returned to the Greek camp, the armor in her arms, the dawn was breaking over the Trojan plain, its light casting long shadows across the bloodied earth. Achilles stood by the sea, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his heart a furnace of grief and rage. Thetis knelt before him, her divine presence, a contrast to his mortal pain, and presented the armor. "Wear this," she said, her voice soft as a wave, "and let it carry you to your fate." Achilles took the shield, its weight heavy with meaning, its scenes a reminder of all that was at stake: love loss, the fragile joys of peace, the relentless tide of war. As he donned the armor, the Greeks gathered their breath, catching at the sight. The bronze gleamed like fire, the helmet's crest swaying like a flame, and Achilles himself seemed transformed, no longer just a man, but a force of divine wrath, a god of death, ready to descend upon the battlefield. The Myrmidons. His loyal warriors raised their spears, their voices a low chant, sensing the storm that was about to break. The Trojans within their walls felt a chill, as if the air itself carried the weight of Achilles' return. Hector, standing among his men, knew the armor he had taken from Patroclus had marked him a beacon, drawing the wrath of the Greeks' greatest warrior. From the ramparts, Andromache watched, her heart tightening, her prayers to Apollo, now a desperate plea for her husband's life. The gods, too, stirred on Olympus, their gazes fixed on the plain below. Athena, ever the Greeks' ally, sharpened her plans, while Apollo, protector of Troy, whispered strength to Hector, though he knew the fates were weaving a darker thread. The battlefield, scarred and silent, awaited its reckoning, the earth trembling as Achilles stepped forward, his armor a blazing star in the morning light. The Greeks, battered but bolstered, followed their hope no longer in victory, but in the destruction Achilles would bring. The armor was more than protection. It was a symbol of Achilles' resolve, a bridge between his mortal grief and his divine destiny. Each step he took rang with the clang of bronze, each breath a vow to see Hector dead. The shield, with its scenes of human life, was a reminder of what he fought for, not just Patroclus, but the world they had dreamed of, a world now lost to him. His rage was no longer a personal slight against Agamemnon. It was a force of nature, a tide that would sweep across the plain, leaving nothing in its wake. The Greeks, seeing their champion reborn, felt a flicker of hope, but also fear, for this Achilles was no longer their hero, but a man consumed, his humanity buried beneath the weight of vengeance. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the foundations of Troy, a duel that would pit the invincible against the steadfast, glory against duty, and leave the world forever changed. Achilles returned to the battlefield like a god of death, his rage manifesting as a massacre, and no Trojan warrior dared stand in his way. The Trojan plain, scarred by a decade of war, trembled beneath his steps, the air thick with the dust of battle and the metallic tang of blood. Clad in the divine armor forged by Hephaestus, Achilles was a vision of terror, his bronze breastplate gleaming like fire, his shield a radiant mirror of the human world, his helmet's golden crest swaying like a flame in the wind. The Greeks, battered and broken, watched in awe as their champion strode forth, the Myrmidons falling in behind him. Their spears raised their voices, a low chant of reverence and fear. Achilles' eyes burned with a fury that seemed to sear the very earth, his heart, a furnace fueled by the loss of Patroclus, his every breath a vow to see Hector's blood spilled. The Trojans, who had surged with confidence under Hector's leadership, now faltered, their courage wilting before the specter of the man they had thought invincible, now returned with a wrath that no mortal could withstand. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse as Achilles carved his path through the Trojan ranks. His spear was a lightning bolt, striking with precision, each thrust felling a warrior, each swing a promise of death. The river Scamander, flowing near the plain, ran red with Trojan blood, its waters choked with the bodies of the fallen. Achilles moved like a storm, his speed unmatched his strength, divine his rage, a force that seemed to bend the laws of nature. Trojan warriors, brave men who had faced death countless times, fled before him, their shields raised in vain, their cries swallowed by the roar of his advance. He was no longer a man, but a force of destruction, a god of death descended to earth, his armor gleaming as if lit by the fires of the underworld. The Greeks followed their spirits, lifted not by hope of victory, but by the sheer terror of their champion, who fought not for them, but for the ghost of Patroclus, whose name he whispered with every kill. Hector, within the walls of Troy, felt the shift in the battle's tide, his heart heavy with the knowledge that his act slaying Patroclus and claiming Achilles' armor had summoned this tempest. From the ramparts, Andromache watched her hands clutching the stone, her prayers to Apollo, now a desperate plea for her husband's life. King Priam, his aged eyes filled with dread, saw the slaughter below, knowing that only Hector could face the storm that was Achilles. The gods, watching from Olympus, were divided. Athena, her eyes gleaming with purpose, guided Achilles' hand, while Apollo, protector of Troy, whispered strength to Hector, though the fates' thread grew ever tighter. The Trojan lines broke, their warriors scattering like leaves before a gale, their courage no match for the divine fury that swept across the plain. Achilles' spear found Lycaon, a son of Priam, begging for mercy. No mercy came, only death swift and cold. He faced Tros, another Trojan prince, and cut him down without a word, his eyes blind to please, his heart deaf to anything but vengeance. The river Scamander itself seemed to rise in protest, its waters swelling as if to swallow Achilles and halt his rampage. But even the river god could not withstand him. Achilles fought through the churning waves, his spear piercing the divine current, his will unyielding. The Trojans, driven back to their walls, cowered behind their gates, their hope dwindling with each body that fell. Achilles' wrath was a fire that consumed all in its path, his armor a beacon of death that shone across the plain. The Greeks, following in his wake, fought with renewed vigor, but their eyes were wide with fear, for this was not the Achilles they had known. This was a man who had crossed into the realm of the divine, his humanity burned away by grief, his every act a step toward his own doom. The battlefield was a canvas of carnage, painted with the blood of Trojans, and Achilles was its artist, his spear, the brush, his rage, the pigment. Yet amidst the slaughter, Achilles' eyes sought one man, Hector. The Trojan prince who had stood as Troy's shield, who had slain Patroclus and taken the armor, was now the sole focus of Achilles' hatred. The plain, once a contested ground, was now a stage for a single inevitable confrontation. The Trojans, seeing their comrades fall, knew that only Hector could face this god of death, yet they feared what that clash would bring. Achilles' return was no triumph. It was a prelude to tragedy, a storm that would sweep away all in its path. The Greeks, watching their champion, felt a chill, for his rage was not theirs to share. It was a personal vendetta, a fire that burned for Patroclus alone. The walls of Troy loomed in the distance, their stones a silent witness to the coming duel, and the air grew heavy with the weight of fate. Achilles, his armor gleaming his heart, A furnace pressed forward, each step a promise of death, each breath a vow to see Hector fall. The stage was set for the climax of the war, a moment that would define not just the fate of Troy, but the legacy of two men whose names would echo through time. Achilles' massacre was no mere act of war. It was a ritual of vengeance, a purging of grief through blood. The Trojans, their courage broken, could only wait, their eyes turning to Hector, their last hope. The gods, their divine counsel torn, watched as the mortal world bent under the weight of Achilles' wrath. The plain soaked in blood awaited its reckoning, and Achilles, the god of death, moved ever closer to the walls, his heart fixed on the man who had taken everything from him. Only Hector, bound by his honor as a commander, remained outside the city gates to face the wrath of Achilles, alone in a fateful duel. The Trojan plain, littered with the bodies of the fallen, lay silent under a sky heavy with the weight of destiny. The walls of Troy, towering and unyielding, stood as a backdrop to the coming clash, their stones bearing witness to a moment that would echo through the ages. Achilles, his divine armor gleaming like a star, strode across the blood-soaked earth, his eyes fixed on the lone figure before the gates. The Greeks, trailing in his wake, halted at a distance, their breaths held, knowing this was no ordinary battle, but a reckoning between two titans. The Trojans, safe behind their walls, watched from the ramparts, their hearts pounding with fear and pride. Andromache, clutching her son Astyanax, stood among them, her face pale, her prayers to Apollo, a desperate whisper. King Priam, his aged hands gripping the stone, wept silently, knowing his son's courage might be his doom. Hector, prince of Troy, stood alone, his spear in hand, his shield raised, his heart steady, despite the terror that Achilles' name inspired. Hector was no coward. He was Troy's champion, the man who had held the city against a decade of Greek onslaught, the warrior who had slain Patroclus and driven the Achaeans to their ships. Yet now, as Achilles approached, his armor blazing like the sun, Hector felt the weight of mortality. He was not invincible, not God-touched like his foe, but a man driven by duty to his city, his family, his honor. He had urged his men to retreat behind the walls to save themselves from Achilles' wrath, but he could not follow. To flee would be to betray everything he stood for, to leave Troy defenseless in spirit, if not in stone. So he stood, his bronze armor gleaming, his dark eyes meeting Achilles' across the plain. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the distant cry of a hawk, as if the gods themselves paused to watch. Apollo, Hector's divine protector, stood unseen at his side, while Athena, cloaked in deception, moved to ensure Achilles' victory. The two warriors faced each other, their voices carrying across the plain, sharp and clear. Hector spoke first, his tone steady, offering terms to honor the fallen. "If I fall," he said, "return my body to my people so I may be mourned. And if you fall, I swear the same." Achilles' reply was a snarl, his eyes blazing with hatred. "There will be no terms, Hector. You took Patroclus from me, and for that you will die. Your body will rot in the dust, food for dogs." The words cut like a blade, and Hector's heart sank, but his resolve did not waver. He knew the gods were watching, knew the fates had spun their thread, but he would not run. The duel began with a clash of spears, their points flashing in the sunlight, their shields ringing like thunder. Hector fought with skill and courage, his movements precise, his spear seeking Achilles' flesh. But Achilles was a storm, his speed blinding his strength, divine his rage, a force that no mortal could match. The combat was a dance of death, each man a master of war, their weapons weaving a pattern of thrust and parry, strike and block. Hector's spear grazed Achilles' shield, its scenes of life and war shimmering under the blow, but Achilles was untouched, his god-forged armor unyielding. The Trojans on the walls held their breath, their hopes pinned on their champion, while the Greeks watched in awe their champion, a god among men. Athena, disguised as Hector's brother Deiphobus, whispered encouragement, luring him into a false sense of aid. Apollo, bound by Zeus's will, could only watch his divine heart heavy. Achilles pressed forward his spear, a blur, his eyes never leaving Hector's. The Trojan prince fought valiantly, his every move a testament to his skill, but he was mortal and Achilles was not. The duel reached its climax when Athena's deception tipped the scale. Hector, believing he had an ally, lunged only to find himself alone. Achilles' spear found its mark, piercing Hector's throat, the blood spilling like a crimson tide. Hector fell, his body crumpling to the earth, his eyes wide with the shock of mortality. The Trojans on the walls cried out a wail of grief that echoed across the plain. Andromache collapsed, her strength gone, while Priam's tears fell like rain. Achilles stood over his foe, his chest heaving, his rage unquenched. "You are nothing," he spat, his voice a growl, "and Troy will fall with you." Hector, with his dying breath, pleaded once more for his body to be returned, but Achilles' heart was stone. The Greeks cheered their voices, a roar of triumph, but it was a hollow victory, for their champion was no longer a man, but a force of vengeance, his humanity burned away by grief. The gods watched in silence, their divine counsel torn, Athena triumphant, Apollo mourning Zeus, bound by the fates. The plain, soaked in blood, bore witness to the fall of Troy's greatest son, and the war, already a decade of sorrow, moved toward its final tragic act. The duel was not just a clash of warriors, but a collision of ideals, Hector's duty to his city against Achilles' pursuit of vengeance, love against rage, mortality against a fleeting grasp at immortality. Hector's death was a wound to Troy, a crack in its unyielding walls, but it was also a mirror held up to Achilles, reflecting the cost of his wrath. The stage was set for the war's final chapter, a moment when humanity would be tested not in battle, but in the quiet of grief, as the consequences of this duel rippled through both camps, drawing the gods and mortals alike toward a reckoning that would redefine them all. In his blind rage, Achilles refused Hector's dying wish, tied the body of his enemy to the back of his chariot, and dragged it in the dust around the walls of Troy for days. The Trojan plain, soaked with the blood of the fallen, lay silent under a sky that seemed to mourn its clouds, heavy with the weight of what had been done. Achilles, his divine armor still gleaming with the fire of vengeance, stood over Hector's lifeless form, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a hatred that had consumed his humanity. The Trojans, watching from their high walls, wailed in horror, their voices a chorus of grief that echoed across the city. Andromache, Hector's wife, collapsed in anguish, her hands clutching the ramparts, her heart breaking for the man who had been Troy's shield. King Priam, his aged face etched with sorrow, wept openly, his tears falling like rain for his son, whose body now lay defiled in the dust. The Greeks, gathered behind Achilles, stood in uneasy silence, their triumph tainted by the savagery of their champion's act. This was no victory of honor, no hero's glory, but a descent into inhumanity, a violation of the sacred laws of war that even the gods could not ignore. Achilles' rage, a fire that had burned since Patroclus' death, found no relief in Hector's fall. His grief, a wound that bled without end, drove him to an act so brutal it shocked both mortal and divine. With a snarl, he bound Hector's ankles with leather thongs, tying them to his chariot, and climbed aboard his whip, cracking like thunder. The horses surged forward, their hooves pounding the earth, dragging Hector's body in a cloud of dust around the walls of Troy. The Trojans, watching from above, cried out in despair, their voices a tide of sorrow that drowned the plain. Women tore their hair, men beat their chests, and children clung to their mothers, unable to comprehend the horror. Andromache's screams pierced the air, her love for Hector now, a torment her son Astyanax, destined to grow without a father. Priam, his strength broken, called out to his son's body, his words lost in the wind, pleading for an end to the desecration. But Achilles, deaf to their grief, drove on his chariot, circling the city again and again, the dust rising like a shroud over Hector's corpse. The gods on Olympus, their divine council torn, watched in dismay. Apollo, protector of Troy, burned with anger, his voice rising in protest at the defilement of Hector's body, a hero who had honored the gods with sacrifices and courage. "This is blasphemy," he cried, his words shaking the heavens to treat a noble warrior as carrion. Athena, ever loyal to Achilles, remained silent, her gaze cold, but even she could not defend the act. Zeus, the arbiter of fate, sat heavy on his throne, his heart torn between his love for Hector and his promise to Thetis. The desecration was a wound to the divine order, a challenge to the laws that bound gods and men. Apollo, unable to bear the sight, shielded Hector's body with his divine power, keeping it unmarred, despite the dragging preserving its dignity, even as Achilles sought to destroy it. The gods debated, their voices a storm, but Zeus decreed that the act must end, that humanity must be restored, though the path to it would be one of sorrow and redemption. For days, Achilles continued his grim ritual, circling Troy's walls, his chariot leaving a trail of dust and blood. The Greeks, once bolstered by his return, now shrank from him, their champion no longer a hero, but a specter of vengeance, his humanity lost to rage. The Myrmidons, loyal but troubled, stood guard over his tent, their eyes averted from the body that trailed behind. Agamemnon, Odysseus, and the other leaders whispered among themselves, their victory soured by the cost. Achilles' heart, once softened by Patroclus' love, was now a stone, unyielding, unfeeling, driven only by the need to punish Hector even in death. Each circuit of the walls was a defiance of mortality, a scream against the loss that had broken him, but it brought no peace. The dust settled on his armor, the blood stained his hands, and still the void within him grew a hunger that no act of vengeance could sate. The Trojans, trapped within their walls, could only watch their grief, a weight that pressed against their hearts. Hector had been their hope, their defender, the man who stood between them and annihilation. Now his body was a symbol of their coming doom, a reminder that even their greatest could fall. The city, once vibrant with life, was now a place of mourning, its streets filled with the sound of lamentation. Priam, his strength fading, sat in his palace, his mind turning to a desperate plan, a way to reclaim his son's body and restore his honor. Andromache, her eyes hollow, held Astyanax close, whispering stories of his father's courage, vowing that his name would live on. The plain below, scarred and silent, bore witness to Achilles' wrath, but it also whispered of a coming reckoning, a moment when humanity might yet be found amidst the horror. The act of desecration was the peak of Achilles' rage, a moment when he crossed the line from hero to monster, his grief twisting into cruelty. Yet it was also a mirror reflecting the cost of vengeance, the price of a heart consumed by loss. The gods, their divine gaze fixed on the plain, knew this could not stand, that the laws of war and honor must be restored. The stage was set for a final act, not of battle but of compassion, a moment when a grieving father and a broken warrior would meet, and the war for one fleeting moment would pause in the face of shared humanity. But the story does not end in hatred. It ends when the elderly king, Priam, Hector's father, comes alone to Achilles' tent at night to beg for his son's body. The Trojan plain, shrouded in darkness, lay silent under a sky pierced by stars. the air heavy with the weight of grief and the faint dust of Achilles' relentless desecration. For days, Hector's body had been dragged behind the chariot, a grim spectacle that tore at the heart of Troy. The city, its walls unbreached, but its spirit broken, mourned its greatest son, the prince who had been their shield against the Greek onslaught. Priam, king of Troy, sat in his palace, his aged frame bent under the sorrow of a father who had lost not just a warrior, but the hope of his people. His eyes, red from weeping, stared into the night, haunted by the image of Hector's body defiled in the dust. Andromache's wails echoed through the halls, her grief for her husband, a mirror of the city's despair, while young Astyanax, too young to understand, clung to his mother, sensing her pain. Yet Priam, driven by a love that outweighed his fear, resolved to act to reclaim his son's body and restore his honor, even if it meant facing the man who had become a god of death. Guided by Hermes the messenger, god cloaked in shadow, Priam left the safety of Troy's walls under cover of night. The journey was perilous, a solitary trek across a plain littered with the dead past Greek sentries who might kill him on sight. His chariot rattled softly, its wheels muffled by divine will, as Hermes led him to the Greek camp by the sea. Priam's heart pounded not with fear of death, but with the weight of his mission to face Achilles, the man who had slain his son, and beg for mercy. The camp was quiet, its fires low, the Greeks sleeping, or keeping watch, unaware of the Trojan king, slipping through their midst. Achilles' tent stood apart its entrance, flanked by Myrmidons, their spears gleaming in the moonlight. Priam, his white hair a stark contrast to the darkness, stepped down from his chariot, his hands empty but for a father's love and a king's dignity. Hermes, his divine guide, vanished, leaving Priam alone to face the storm that was Achilles. Inside the tent, Achilles sat, his divine armor laid aside, his eyes hollow with the exhaustion of rage. The firelight cast shadows on his face, revealing a man not triumphant, but tormented, his heart still bleeding for Patroclus, his vengeance bringing no peace. Priam entered unannounced, his presence a shock to the Myrmidons, who stood frozen, their hands on their swords. But Priam, undeterred, knelt before Achilles, his hands clasping the warrior's knees in the ancient gesture of supplication. His voice, trembling but clear, broke the silence. "I am Priam, father of Hector," he said, his eyes meeting Achilles's. "I have come to beg for my son's body, to give him the rights he deserves. Think of your own father, Peleus, who waits for you across the sea, who loves you as I loved my son. We are both fathers bound by grief." The words hung in the air, heavy with truth, piercing the armor of Achilles' rage. The Greek warrior, his face a mask of stone, felt something stir within him, a memory of his own father, of a home he might never see again, of a life untouched by war. The tent was silent, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the distant lapping of the sea. Priam's tears fell, his aged hands trembling, as he spoke of Hector not as a warrior, but as a son, a husband, a father. He spoke of the love that had filled Troy's halls, of the laughter that once echoed where now only grief remained. Achilles listened, his eyes softening, his heart cracking under the weight of shared sorrow. The image of Peleus old and waiting rose unbidden in his mind, and for the first time since Patroclus' death, Achilles felt not rage but a deep, aching humanity. He wept his tears, mingling with Priam's, two men, bound not by war but by loss. The Greeks outside, hearing the sound, stood in awe, sensing a shift in their champion, a return of the man beneath the god of death. The gods, watching from Olympus, held their breath. Zeus, who had decreed this moment, nodded in approval, while Apollo, guardian of Hector, found solace in the act to come. Achilles rose, his voice gentle, and took Priam's hand, lifting him from the ground. "You have moved me, old man," he said, his words soft as a breeze. "Your son's body will be returned, and you will have time to mourn him." He ordered his men to prepare Hector's body, to wash it and anoint it with oils, to wrap it in fine cloth, shielding it from further shame. Priam, his heart heavy with both grief and gratitude, watched as the Greeks treated his son with care, their hands gentle where once they had been cruel. The act was a bridge, a moment of compassion that crossed the chasm of war. Achilles, his rage ebbing, like a receding tide, saw in Priam not an enemy, but a mirror of his own loss, a reminder of the humanity he had nearly lost. The two men shared a meal, a simple act of breaking bread that spoke of peace, however fleeting, in the heart of conflict. The return of Hector's body was no victory, but a restoration, a reclaiming of honor for both men. Priam, his mission complete, prepared to return to Troy, his chariot bearing the body of his son, now treated with the dignity of a hero. Achilles, watching him go, felt the weight of his own mortality, knowing his own death was near as the fates had foretold. The Greek camp, stirred by the encounter, whispered of their champion's change, while Troy, awaiting Priam's return, prepared to mourn. The war paused, for this moment would resume, but the meeting of Priam and Achilles was a light in the darkness, a reminder that even in the crucible of hatred, compassion could endure. Achilles returned Hector's body, and in that moment the hero rediscovered his own humanity, not by killing his enemy, but by empathizing with his enemy's pain. The Greek camp, bathed in the soft light of dawn, stood still, as the weight of the night's events settled over it like a quiet tide. The tent where Achilles and Priam had met once, a place of rage and vengeance, was now a sanctuary of shared sorrow, its air heavy with the scent of olive oil and the faint crackle of a dying fire. Achilles, his divine armor set aside, sat in silence, his eyes no longer burning with hatred, but softened by the tears he had shed with Priam. The Trojan king, his aged frame bent but unbowed, prepared to leave his chariot, bearing the body of his son Hector, now cleansed and wrapped in fine cloth, restored to the dignity of a hero. The Myrmidons, standing guard, lowered their spears, their faces reflecting a mix of awe and unease, for their champion had changed. His wrath, once a storm that consumed all, had given way to something deeper, something human. The Greeks, whispering among themselves, sensed a shift, a moment when the war's relentless brutality paused, if only for a breath. Priam's visit had been a spark in the darkness, a reminder of the ties that bind men even in the crucible of conflict. When he knelt before Achilles, clasping his knees, speaking of fathers and sons, he had pierced the armor of rage that had encased the Greek warrior since Patroclus's death. Achilles, who had slain Hector and dragged his body in the dust, who had defied the gods and the laws of war, now saw in Priam a mirror of his own heart. The old king's words of Peleus, Achilles' father, waiting across the sea of the love that binds parent to child, had stirred memories of a life beyond the battlefield, a life of home and hearth that Achilles knew he might never see again. His tears, falling alongside Priam's, were not just for Patroclus, but for himself, for the boy he had been, for the man he could have become. In that tent, under the flickering light, two enemies had become men bound by grief, united by the universal language of loss. The act of returning Hector's body was no small gesture. It was a reclamation of honor, not just for Hector, but for Achilles himself. He ordered his men to wash the body, to anoint it with oils, to wrap it in soft linens, ensuring that Hector would be mourned as a prince, not defiled as a trophy. The Greeks who carried out the task moved with care, their hands gentle, where once they had been cruel, their silence a testament to the weight of the moment. Priam, watching, felt a flicker of gratitude amidst his sorrow, his heart eased by the knowledge that his son would receive the rights he deserved. Achilles, standing by, spoke softly to the king, promising a truce, a brief pause in the war so Troy could mourn its fallen hero. "Take him home," he said, his voice steady but heavy, "and let your people sing his name." The words were a bridge, a fragile thread of peace woven through the tapestry of war, a reminder that even in the heart of hatred, compassion could find a way. As Priam's chariot rolled away, bearing Hector's body back to Troy, the Trojan plain seemed to exhale its scars, softened by the morning light. The city, its walls towering, but its spirit wounded, prepared to receive its prince. Andromache, her face streaked with tears, would lead the mourning, her voice rising in a lament that would echo through Troy's streets. Astyanax, too young to understand, would be held close, his father's memory, a flame that would burn in his mother's stories. Priam, returning to his palace, would oversee the funeral, the pyre built high, the offerings rich as Troy paused to honor the man who had been its heart. The Trojans, their grief a tide would gather, to sing of Hector's courage, his love, his sacrifice, their voices, a chorus that would carry his name beyond the walls, beyond the war into the ages. The gods, watching from Olympus, nodded in approval. Zeus, who had willed this moment, saw balance restored, while Apollo, guardian of Hector, found solace in the rites to come. For Achilles, the return of Hector's body was a turning point, a moment when he stepped back from the edge of inhumanity. His rage, which had driven him to slaughter and desecration, had burned itself out, leaving behind a man who could weep, who could see his enemy as a father, a son, a man like himself. The war was not over, Achilles knew. His own death was near, as the fates had decreed. But in that tent he had found something greater than glory, the ability to feel another's pain, to share in their sorrow, to recognize the humanity that binds all men even in war. The Greeks, watching their champion, saw not a god of death, but a man reborn, his heart no longer stone, but flesh capable of compassion. The truce he granted, though brief, was a gift to both sides, a space to breathe, to mourn, to remember what it meant to be human. The funeral of Hector, when it came, was a moment of solemn beauty, a pause in the relentless march of war. The pyre burned bright, its flames licking the sky as Troy gathered to say farewell. The Greeks, honoring the truce, kept their distance, their spears lowered, their eyes turned to the city that mourned. Achilles, alone by the sea, watched the distant glow, his thoughts on Patroclus, on Hector, on the fleeting nature of life. His true victory was not in killing his enemy, but in this act of empathy, this recognition of shared humanity. The war would resume its end, drawing near, but for now the plain was quiet, the air filled with the sound of mourning, the scent of burning wood, and the fragile hope that even in the heart of conflict, compassion could endure. And so, dear friends, we leave the plains of Troy in quiet reverence as Achilles finds his heart amidst the ashes of rage. The clash of titans fades not in victory, but in shared sorrow. Hector's pyre burns bright, a fleeting truce in a war unending. The stars above hold their vigil, waiting for fate to unfold. Thank you for joining us on Sleep Stories TV. If this tale stirred your soul, subscribe and tap the bell. Share your thoughts below, whose courage moved you most. Until next time, let the stars cradle your dreams.